I got mates with the coolest. Not that I hope we're mates eventually down the track. I know this is our little intro here. But I got a mate with the last name Speed. I got a mate with the last name Strong, and I'm like Milo Wolf. Especially just like, was Wolf just a badass animal? But Milo, were your parents into the whole idea of progressive overload? It
Not
didn't
at
come
all.
from.
But
It's not the guy pushing the rock up the hill.
unfortunately not. Hey man, that's Sisyphus. That's not Milo.
Sisyphus.
What
It's
is wrong
Sisyphus.
with you?
Oh,
Milo and
What was
Sisyphus?
Milo doing? Milo was carrying the calf up the hill? Or am I just talking?
No. Around the arena, around the Colosseum.
So I put.
Is that
I
the
turned
progressive overload
Sisyphus's
thing?
boulder into a cow and added a hill to it. So the story of progressive overload.
Sisyphus is the hill and the boulder, right? Milo is the calf around the Colosseum. So every day he would carry the calf around the Colosseum. By the way, his diet was, I believe, 10 pounds of bread a day, 10 pounds of meat, and 10 liters of wine. Apparently, this is rumored to be true. He was getting wasted.
Surplus.
Hey, man, and he was carrying the calf around the arena every day. And as the calf grew, so did he. And eventually he was yoked out of his mind. So
right.
You won't go past any uni lecture without having that as the progressive overload thing.
I thought he had to carry the calf up the hill to get the good grass. I must have been told the most bastardized version of this story.
Nah, man, you got it all wrong. That was, it's kind of like Sisyphus and Milo put together. Not quite Milo.
Oh, well, I've just publicly shamed myself on the podcast, not for the first or the last time. Guys, we're here back with another amazing episode today. I've got my co-host, Jacob. Harvey, still being affected by diarrhea. We're here with one of the leaders, both in terms of influencing, but actually doing the research and producing the studies and stuff that we're all in, that underpin our practice. I'm joined today by Milo Wolf. Welcome to the show.
Hey, man. Happy to be here. It's an honor.
Can you give us a little bit of an intro? Because I've sort of been aware of you, I would say sort of ballpark for the last year. The first long form conversation I heard from you was the, I guess, reanalysis of the most recent squats versus hip thrust study, which it'd be cool to touch on that down the line. But can you just talk to us about, give us a brief summary of your life up until this point? Don't be afraid of getting a little bit long-winded, because I'm sure there's some entertaining anecdotes in there. And if it's boring, I'll just cut you off.
We love long-winded.
Yeah.
Hey, man, let's do it. So first got into lifting when I was 13 or 14. Just stopped playing soccer. I believe you're in the US. Are you in the US? Are you in the UK?
We call it soccer. We're Australian.
Oh, damn. Okay, so it's like nighttime where you are right now.
Yeah, Jacob's ethnically ambiguous, though, so it's hard to tell.
It's very, very hard. Yeah, I could be anywhere in the world right now.
That is true. I mean, same with you, Angus. Like, I couldn't have told you. Then again, I suck with accents. But anyways, so 13 or 14, stopped playing soccer, started lifting weights. First couple of years, did all the good stuff, aka watching Mike Chang, six-pack shortcuts, intermittent fasting, keto diets, tricep days, ab days, 25 sets to failure, you know, everything a beginner
Simply
should
Shredded?
be doing. No, never heard of that. But I was following like Mike Chang buff dudes. Those were like my first two influences, I think. So not the best. Anyways, started lifting at 13 or 14, kept lifting. And eventually when I turned 17, I was like, okay, what do I want to do with my adult life? And I was like, yeah, the one thing I'm actually doing in my free time that I don't hate, besides playing video games, is lifting weights. And I'd been reading stuff like string theory, and now strong by science, as it's called.
Yeah.
And it was pretty interesting, you know, like the science behind things. And so I was like, let me go ahead and study sports science. And so I went into my undergrad in sports science in the UK at Loughborough University. Did my undergrad, finished that, was like, this was pretty cool, but also didn't learn a whole lot of stuff about lifting weights specifically, which was ultimately what I care about. I didn't really, to be honest, give too much of a shit about sports in general. Just cared about lifting weights and getting jacked and strong. And so at the end of my undergrad, I was like, let me learn some more stuff about this. But it turned out that master's programs don't actually teach you that much more about lifting specifically. Like, you don't get a master's in lifting weights and getting jacked. You get a master's in sports science more broadly, and that's not super specific. And so I spoke to a few people and was advised to apply for a PhD straight up. And so I applied for a PhD, got in, and as of a few months ago, finished my PhD in sports science. So I'm now Dr. Milo Wolf, finally. That was a long process.
That was one of my questions. Are you doctor? So you're full-fledged doctor now?
I am full-fledged doctor.
Dr. Wolf. Wow.
Yeah,
sounds so cool.
Fucking mad.
Third of my family, by the way.
Before you...
Oh, wow.
Wait, what? How many, sorry?
Third Doctor now in the family.
Oh, so it's not that
So
special.
third Doctor Wolf.
It's just
not that
another
special.
Dr. Wolf.
Inflated currency. Yeah.
What I was about, so masters, obviously you're heavily constrained. It's like kind of what your supervisor's interests are that dictate your research. Obviously the coursework, you have no say over that. As soon as you're in PhD, it's literally you're leading the show in terms of what you're researching.
By and large, yeah, it depends on the country you're in. In some countries, depending whether or not it's funded or not, like if you have a funded PhD, typically your supervisors and the university, whoever's funding you, really determines what are you going to study. But in the UK, especially, you don't have any lectures. You just go in for 3 years. You have a research plan. You do your plan. You get some help from people. But by and large, it's super self-centered and self-led. Like you're the one running the show. Whereas, for example, in the US, it's like a 5-year process. Oftentimes, you have lectures. You have a lot more supervision. In the UK and in Europe in general, it's a lot more like 3 years. You do some research, you write it up, and you're done.
So Seidman did 2 more years of PhD than you.
Probably, yeah, shit, you know.
Has he
It's
produced
funny
any
'cause
studies?
I'm not sure he has.
I've never seen
me
him
search
post
it up.
anything. I know he references a lot of in vitro studies to support the 90-degree.
Man, I'm not sure what the feelings on Paul Carter are around here, but he reminds
no,
me
we
of Paul
hate him.
Carter.
He's on red in my
Awesome.
fucking requests.
Respect.
Ooh.
Because he always like cites PMIDs, and then you look at the PMIDs and they have very little to do with what he's actually talking about. And it's like, did you read the study you're referencing? Because it doesn't support your argument in the least. And it's the same with Joel Seedman. We'll just be like, yep, this paper, and no one reads papers. Like the average paper gets 13 reads. So no one's going to go check your PMIDs, by the way, but he still does it.
So the specific reason Paul Carter was in my DMs is because I made a meme about people misappropriating research, and Kassem shared it about Paul Carter, and then Paul Carter shared it about Kassem, and it was about both of them.
Bro, crazy. Yeah, it really did be like that.
Paul Carter, I don't know. Paul Carter has a massive fan base, and like a lot of people that I really like are really into him, and I'm always confused by it. And like, because I think probably like, I would say at least 60% of the things he talks about is, from my perspective on hypertrophy, which is not a special interest of mine, it seems like pretty bang on. But then there's like 40% where he's just alternating, sort of licks his finger, sees which way the wind's blowing. Or who's his research daddy? He has one. Beardsley.
And research daddy, by the way, is a very loose term here. Beardsley hasn't really.
Sorry,
done
that's
any
a
research
shit
either.
question. Sorry, you go.
No, man. Beardsley hasn't really done any research either. And he has these weird ideas that very few other people in the field agree with.
I thought he was like a Schoenfeld. I respect.
Oh hell no, bro. Like not even close. No. Don't compare the two, please.
Right.
No.
Go on.
Whoa.
Schoenfeld actually has conducted like 300 studies or something like that.
Yeah.
On actual hypertrophy. To my knowledge, Chris Beardsley's background is in geology or something, like not sports science. And so his literacy of sports science is relatively limited. And so he's come up with some ideas that are, one, haven't actually been substantiated at all. So for example, neuromechanical matching or that sort of idea. He draws that from areas that aren't actually hypertrophy and then just pretends that model is completely correct according to the evidence.
I just remember him sharing so many correlations based on hip thrust studies, like hip thrust increasing amount of like tackles made on the rugby field. And I was like, oh, this is just leaping.
Bro, it's wild. He always has these obscure, like oblique takes on stuff because he's not actually done a degree in sports science. So he has a weird reading of things. But yeah, by and large, it's the same as Paul Carter. Paul Carter, as you said, 60% to 80% maybe of his takes are good. But then the remaining 20 or 40% are pretty poor.
It sort of seems like it stands on his opinions on 40% of the topics stem on his relationship status with Kaz. Because I think they broke up over do shrugs train the upper traps? And I'm like, I don't think we could be
that has to be
this
the most
boys.
pointless argument in the fitness industry by far, in my opinion.
Right, that Levada thing, it can't do all of the work. Like, or maybe, I don't know. What the fuck do I know?
Those arguments are crazy to me as well, man. Like, I don't even know where to start. It's the same as the recent argument. There's a whole argument about long muscle length training, which I'm sure we'll get into. But that is also super difficult to disentangle. Because, for example, recently, Paul Carter made a story about, does lengthened training benefit hypertrophy through sarcomerogenesis, or the addition of sarcomere series in a muscle, right? And his citation for that claim was a study looking at limb lengthening surgery. So forget lifting and lengthen position. He straight up cited a paper on limb lengthening surgery.
Wait, so
people
it's
have,
in
like, different-
the effect on a muscle after the limb?
Yes,
Because what is the
yes,
process of limb lengthening? They put a titanium rod in, but then what do they do with the
Yes,
muscles?
I'm not sure how that relates to lifting weights, to be honest with you. I just don't know. And that's the same thing as like him citing PMIDs that have little to nothing to do with the question at hand.
So much free
he
content there with
actually-
all these errors, I feel like. Is no one taking advantage of it all?
Yeah, Milo is. He's done two call outs to Paul. They're fucking amazing. So Jacob's a bit oblivious on the hypertrophy stuff. He's been focusing on trying to dunk a basketball.
Yeah.
Which he did today.
Hey, respect. An actual sport. Very good.
All right, let me just car crash segue this into the fucking partial squats for sprint performance, because there's just too much hypertrophy stuff that I want to dive into. I was curious to sort of get your take on, is it just me wanting to explain myself? Because maybe I didn't have enough nuance with my post. You know, the medium's the message, Instagram, we're all there to grab some attention. I think that was a topic on the the power building debate that got released yesterday. But I looked at the study that everyone loves when it comes to partial squats for increasing, was it counter movement jump and 40-yard dash? There was, I think, two studies where there was no difference. And then there was one study where the quarter squats went so fucking ham. And it was like, I know you're a busy fucking guy. You're doing your own research. You're doing the hypertrophy. I'm not sure if you went back and read that study, but the thing that where my eyes or ears pricked up about it was with the quarter squat group, they apparently took 0.4 of a second off some highly trained collegiate athletes' 40-yard time. And it was just when I got to that, I'm like, I don't know if steroids would do that. Sorry, actually, I also have not questions for you, but questions in general about what can steroids even do? Like, how much would it even take off your time? But it was more when I saw that, I was like, it reminded me of remember the Barbalo study on squats versus hip thrusts, where Greg Knuckles was like, you put 30 kilos on these ladies' squat PRs in like 6 weeks with just with the squat protocol that they were testing against hip thrusts. And it was more just getting results like that. And then, because I was trying to look through the program, I was like, was there any other differences as well? Because it just seemed so suspect to me that changing the ROM of one of your resistance training movements, which we already expect would have limited transfer to running. We can talk about the jumping. I'm more interested in sprinting speed than running. I was like, that was another sort of red flag I had about the study. And my logic as well, sort of, I don't want to come across as a ROM zealot. And I think it's actually something that you talk about a lot. It's just like, let's not get attached to any of these ideas. And I think that's really cool as well. And like, I'm into the idea of just squatting variously. My whole motto for GPP is sort of like train variously. I'm a fan of that, especially when you're sort of seeking out the general qualities alongside your sport sort of thing. It was just that like all of it was just regular strength and conditioning. There was no sort of information about their sprint training, whether or not they were doing plyometrics. From what I could tell, there was no plyometrics. There was just like a power clean in there. It was just, I don't know. It seemed like a bit of a funky study.
Yeah, so it's interesting you say that. First off, let me preface this with sprinting and counter movement jumps and in general, like GPP, not my area of expertise. My stuff is range of motion, right? With that being said, in the meta-analysis, we did have a few studies that measured vertical jump and sprint speeds. And specifically, usually it's in the context of squatting with different depths, right? So a full squat, that's usually slightly below parallel, around parallel, to like a half squat, right? Generally, you see the same or slightly better outcomes when training the range of motion of your outcome. Now, we specifically looked at an analysis looking at, okay, well, we have different ranges of motion in the outcome, right? Like, for example, if the study assessed a full range of motion 100 max, then ultimately that outcome has a range of motion component that is full. Versus certain outcomes, like for example, a partial range of motion 100 max, that would be inherently biased towards the group that did a partial range of motion because it's more specific. Your training specificity is higher. And so when we categorize performance outcomes, like for example, squat 100 max or sprinting or jumping, what have you, into being either more of a partial range of motion or more of a full range of motion, or being neither. And by neither, I mean, for example, an isometric test. You generally do see that training the range of motion of your outcome leads to better outcomes. And that seems to be the case. So range of motion adaptations are somewhat specific, at least, in terms of performance. With that being said, when it comes specifically to jumping and sprinting, we don't have a ton of data. We have a few studies where generally you either see similar improvements in, for example, vertical jump or counter movement jump height, or you see slightly better improvements with partial range of motion. And that makes sense when you kind of zoom out and look at the broader outcomes of not just counter movement jumps and sprint tests, sorry. You do see that specificity of range of motion does apply. In general, there's a few mechanisms underlying this which seem to make sense, right? For example, you can see a shift in the length tension relationship of a muscle where, you know, you have a certain relationship between how long your muscle is or different joint angles and how much force your muscle can produce at those joint angles. One of the mechanisms that might underpin specific adaptations, for example, in jump height and sprint speed, when you're training for partial range of motion, is just that your muscles are specifically kind of changing in architecture to facilitate force production at those angles that are used in sprinting, right?
Getting a little bit Franz Bosch.
Sorry?
Do you know Franz Bosch?
I have no idea who Franz Bosch is.
Let's not go into it, but it's a fun rabbit hole for you to look into after if you want to see some water bags.
Awesome. Let's do it. But yeah, so in general, the way I see it is, if you look at the actual data and you look at the differences between a full range of motion approach and a partial range of motion approach, it doesn't make a huge difference. The main thing may just be lift weights, right? Or do some sort of work. However, because of specificity and because of the limited number of studies we have showing generally a neutral to positive effect in favor of training in the range of motion of your outcome with counter movement jumps and with sprint speeds, I do think there should be some, at least, partial range of motion training if you're an athlete who's trying to improve their jump or sprint speed.
But pragmatically looking at it, like it's not like you just have your sprint training and then your slow resistance training. Like you've got so much sprint related training that's also partial ROM, like a lot of your plyometrics and stuff like that. Yeah. So it was more in that thinking of like, okay, so with my hopping, my bounding, and all my running, I'm going partial range of motion. Then do I also go partial range of motion and look for maximizing dynamic correspondence or specificity with all of my stuff? Because I think that was one of the sort of in the conclusions of the study, they were sort of just like probably just, you know, squatting through different sorts of range of motion is probably beneficial. So the last point that I forgot as well to add on, like where I've sort of landed on doing biasing a fuller range of motion when looking for transference to overall sprint speed is where, from my understanding, strength training has the greatest transference to sprinting is in the acceleration phase. You are not moving as fast at that stage. You have longer to apply force into the ground. Once you are in the upright phase, where that is more reminiscent of the ROM that people are talking about in a quarter squat. Like that's when that would apply. But at that point, the quarter squatting is too slow, in my opinion, which I know holds nothing. There's no data to support this, but just based off what we know about dynamic correspondence and the theories on that in general. Whereas where strength training could theoretically have higher transfer in the acceleration phase, this is where, like, when you have a look at athletes coming out of the blocks, they'll have their knee like up on their chest almost. So it was more just sort of thinking along the lines of that, like, okay, let's look at the part of running in general where strength training would have the transfer. And it's like, if you wanted to make the specific ROM argument, and so that's where like the whole thing I am struggling to make sense of that evidence within my worldview training philosophy, I guess, as a whole.
Sure, man. I fully agree with you. And there's a few things to keep in mind here. One is that specificity is ultimately on a continuum and shouldn't just be considered on one exercise or one activity. It should be considered, okay, as a whole, as your whole exercise routine, are you specific enough? Right?
Yes.
So for example, you could be highly non-specific in your lifting as long as you're highly specific in your actual sport practice. And that would still give you sufficient specificity overall, right? Equally, you could say that maybe we do partial range of motion squats because they're more specific and we want to increase specificity of the program overall. I think that's fine. You don't need to consider everything in isolation as far as specificity goes. And there is likely such a thing as being too specific in your whole program. The other thing is, these studies rarely look at the way athletes actually train, right? So in these studies, oftentimes, even when they're measuring vertical jump height or sprint speeds, A, we're not talking about high trained athletes. B, we're not talking about a program where they are doing their sport specific practice a few times a week and then lifting a few times a week and also doing not just squats, but other exercises as well. So it's unclear how these results translate to actually what people do in real life. And so with all that combined, it's to say that there might be a slight effect in favor of doing some partial range of motion squats in your training, but it's not as though it's going to be a big difference, and it's also going to be very contextual. The important thing that and this is not my area of expertise, but I think with strength and conditioning specifically, a lot of practices seem to be based on not much evidence. And so in an area where we do have some evidence at least, right? It's, for me, it's like, because I know this evidence relatively well, it's tempting to just say, look, we have evidence here. Let's kind of trust it because we have evidence, at least in this one area, if that makes sense. Yeah. So that's kind of my thoughts. But equally, as I said, I acknowledge the studies aren't super consistent, but it is generally a positive effect.
I should also disclose some biases. My company name is General Physical Preparation.
Wow. I mean, hey, that's why you're second only team full ROM and you're a full ROM bias.
Yeah, because I thought about it so much. I was like, oh, I was not from the team full ROM example necessarily, but just from knees over toes guy. There's so many business names you can point to as an example. Like, man, if the evidence starts heading in a different direction, this is gonna be quite awkward for the company. I was like, because everyone in business talks about like, you know, if you're going to sell your company, it can't be Angus Bradley PT. And that's a whole nother conversation because who's selling their fucking companies at the end of the day? But I was just like, General Physical Preparation. I was like, what's the worst that could be done to that in terms of like the overall body of evidence? I was like, feels kind of safe. But I did have those thoughts. Maybe everything will just be like, nah, fuck it. Full fucking specificity. Let's steer into something that you are a celebrated expert in. Full ROM training is, I romanticize full ROM, right? Like when you're watching, if I do go out of my way to watch some bodybuilding clips, I wouldn't ever do that, but I love watching Olympic weightlifters. Like again, when I first saw powerlifting, after getting into, you know, just lifting for myself, I was like, oh, what are the strongest people? How do they lift? I didn't like powerlifting squat depth. I've come to terms with bench arches and things like that just because I respect the technical skill, but it wasn't the lifting that I romanticized. And the evidence, conveniently enough, it sort of helped us lean into this bias. And you fucking come along, or was it you? What got you thinking about this? Was there some other research that sort of you thought we should take another look at range of motion? How did this all get started?
Yeah, man. So when I was finishing my undergrad, one thing that was on my mind was range of motion. The reason for that was I was working for Renaissance Periodization, who also happened to have created a team full ROM, that brand. And so at the time, I was fully sold on the idea that, hey, full range of motion is best for hypertrophy. However, right around the time I was applying for a PhD, the first systematic review on range of motion actually came out, basically saying, look, we only have 6 studies here. We have 4 studies on lower body where things seem pretty consistent, that full range of motion is better for hypertrophy. In the upper body, we only have 2 studies, and there things are a bit less clear. One study actually found more hypertrophy with a partial range of motion compared to full range of motion, which kind of raised some eyebrows, right? And so I was like, okay, if I'm applying for a PhD and I employ full range of motion in my training anyways, as a result of my company I'm working for and my sort of biases and everything, I may as well do some studies here where it's warranted because we don't have a lot of evidence. Went to my PhD, about a year and a half into it, finished my meta-analysis because at the time we didn't have a quantitative analysis of the results. We only had a systematic review, which kind of summarized the studies in text more so than actually looking at the effects. And so we conducted a meta-analysis, and when I got the results, spent, a few months getting all the studies together. When I actually got the results of the analyses, it took me a few days to digest. I remember texting a client and being like, this isn't what I expected. Like, this is distinctly different. And in between the first review paper and my review paper, there have been a few more studies, right? And so I was like, yeah, maybe the evidence now doesn't support it as much as before. But basically, a previous review paper had found an effect size of like 0.8, which is large, very large even, in favor of full range of motion over partial range of motion for muscle growth. And so when I got my results, and I had more studies in my analysis because they only looked at lower body, there were a few more studies that had come out since that analysis anyways. But when I got my results, I was like, wait a minute, there's only an effect size of 0.1 in favor of full range of motion here. What's going on?
Ooh.
Well, one,
That's a
there were
huge
only-
difference as well.
That's a huge difference. That's a huge difference. The biggest thing by far was that they only looked at lower body studies. And as I said, in lower body, it seemed pretty consistently the case that full range of motion was better for hypertrophy than partial range of motion. And the second thing is more studies have come out comparing full range of motion not to short muscle length partials or kind of partial reps in a peak squeeze of a movement, like the top of bicep curl. But now there are more studies comparing full range of motion to lengthened partials.
Because I
or that
imagine
bottom
just
half.
from stereotypes about partial range of motion training, which I know you go out of your way to debunk, like even I would stereotype whenever anyone talks about partial range of motion, your assumption is that they're talking about a shortened bias.
Yep.
And what
Because the
was a
squat comes
lot
to
of
mind,
the research,
you know?
not the stuff you were analyzing, but for what you found of partial ROM research, is a lot of it focused on the shortened bias, or there was sort of even?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That's the reason why initially we found that full range of motion was better for hypertrophy, because we didn't actually dig deeper and say,
It was the
well,
only
were
thing
these partial
pushing it
reps
to the stretch.
basically, yeah, like it was 80% or so studies comparing shortened partials to full range of motion and about 20% comparing longer muscle length partials to full range of motion. And so just by consequence of that bias in the research, when you just compare full range of motion to partial range of motion, you saw more hypertrophy with full range of motion. But it wasn't because full range of motion was this magical thing. It was just because it included longer muscle lengths more often than not compared to partial range of motion. And so when we went and compared full range of motion to lengthened partials and full range of motion to shortened partials, in the research, it turned out that, well, full range of motion is certainly better for hypertrophy than shortened partials, just doing partial reps at the top, like a half squat, for example, or doing just the top part of the preacher curl. But then when you compared full range of motion to lengthened partials, and there weren't many studies at the time, there were only 3, it seemed like lengthened partials might actually lead to more hypertrophy. And so maybe range of motion itself doesn't really matter that much for hypertrophy, right? Hot take. But it's more so about the muscle length it allows you to train at. And specifically, the longer the muscle length you train at, generally, the more hypertrophy you see. And then
Is there a
more studies
point
came
where
out.
you go so absurd with it that I'm trying to think of a good example of this. I'm trying to think because it's like
Sure.
you just a lot of it I've seen is sort of like lengthened lats. Sorry, let me just segue into the rest of the questions that I've pre-prepared instead of umming and ahhing through another one. What can we talk about stretch mediated hypertrophy in general? Because I feel like that was something that has been supported by the evidence for some time, right? Like that's not a new idea, or is that
Sure.
a bit fresh?
Yeah, so first of all, I would put quotation marks around stretch mediated hypertrophy. And the reason for that is, let's not equate the hypertrophy we see when doing passive stretching for an hour a day or more in animal models often to what we see with hypertrophy training, right?
Who's the guy? Who was the big guy who used to preach about that? There was a protocol, right?
Dante Trudel.
Yes.
Dog crap DC training. Yeah, for sure.
Yes.
Dante
So we're
Trudel.
not talking about, explicitly, it's not stretching. It's like in hypertrophy movements
Indeed.
in the lengthened ROM. That half, let's just
Correct.
say.
Correct. And there's no reason to assume the mechanisms there are the same, right? Because we're talking about durations of exposure and intensity of exposure, and even the muscle length involved is very different. When you're doing passive stretching in these studies, typically, often in animal models, by the way, where they're being weighed down by like twice their body weight, for example, with birds, they're being weighted down for 24/7, often super high intensities and at maximal muscle lengths the whole time. So just like at the end range of motion.
How
And
long
then
are they
with lengthened
torturing these
partials.
animals for? I don't want to turn this
For
into
weeks and weeks. For weeks and weeks
Holy
often,
shit.
you know?
Damn.
Yeah. And then we're taking results from that and the mechanisms there and trying to apply them to lengthened partials versus full range of motion. We're talking about across a session, spending maybe an extra half a minute, right? Or maybe a minute in the lengthened position. Those are very different things. So to assume the mechanisms are the same, not to straw man it or draw a bad comparison, but it's kind of the same as saying that the mechanisms behind cardio adaptations are the same as hypertrophy. With cardio, oftentimes you're doing 30 hours of training a week. With lifting, you're often in the gym for a few hours a week. It's not the same thing, you know?
Yeah. And like
So
we've
stretch
all
mediated
felt our
hypertrophy
legs
is-
blow up when we're running, but it's not building muscle.
Yeah, you know, it's yeah, exactly. And so there's a big caveat there where I think people want to equate the mechanisms in both cases, but it's super unwarranted. And the big issue here is that in these studies that we have comparing full range of motion to shortened partials or full range of motion to lengthened partials, very rarely are the mechanisms actually measured. And so we can't know for sure what is going on. All we can say with pretty good confidence at this point is that lengthened partials seem to lead to more hypertrophy. And to kind of draw a broader point, we have around 20 or 25 studies all in all, comparing shortened training to lengthened training and measuring hypertrophy. So I'm talking about 9 studies now comparing lengthened partials, just partial reps in the lengthened position, to shortened partials or partial reps in the shortened position. And out of those 9 studies, 8 have found a benefit to lengthened partials over shortened partials. Likewise, with full range of motion versus lengthened partials, we now have 5 studies. Out of those 5, 4 found a benefit in favor of lengthened partials over full range of motion. 1 found no difference. And then finally, we have 5 studies. Indeed. On top of that, we have 5 studies comparing isometrics at different muscle lengths. So lengthened isometrics or shortened isometrics, and again, consistently see more hypertrophy with lengthened isometrics. And so all in all, we have like 20 or 25 studies where the general principle of lengthened resistance training seems to lead to more hypertrophy than shortened resistance training is quite consistent. And so like, compared to evidence on volume or relative intensity even, we have a pretty good amount of studies here, very good consistency. And so it's interesting to me sometimes to see the pushback on specifically
like one of the
training.
better bodies of evidence. Because my typical reaction to a lot of bodies of evidence is like, it's a bit average.
Yeah.
That's actually pretty much my reaction almost every single body of evidence, but like, that's solid. That's what is this thing I keep hearing about? Questions about, do all muscle groups respond similarly to stretch mediated hypertrophy? Can you talk about that? Like, how certain can we be? I guess, what is the assumption? I guess naturally you would assume it does apply to every muscle, or like, is the thought behind the mechanism, if this has been studied, like something to do with the muscle's architecture, or like, do all muscles like follow the rules of like the length tension relationships? And
Sure. So I'm going to give you the applied answer first, and that is to say the muscles we've actually studied. The claim is often that, for example, the biceps and triceps don't respond to lengthened training in terms of hypertrophy. But we actually have 3 studies in the triceps and I believe 4 in the biceps. And across these 3 and 4 studies, the degree of consistency is also pretty high. So for the triceps, out of 3 studies, 2 have found more hypertrophy with lengthened training versus shortened training, and 1's found no difference, right? So again, generally in favor of lengthened training being better. With the biceps, I think we have 4 studies, of which 2 or 3 found more hypertrophy with lengthened training, and 1 or 2 found no difference. So again, it's still a neutral positive effect in favor of lengthened training, even in these muscle groups that people claim that there won't be a benefit in. The important thing here is that these people claim there is no benefit for these muscle groups, not because they've read the data on the actual hypertrophy, right? Because there, as I said, there are studies in these muscle groups. So we can look at those studies and see, was there more hypertrophy? And in fact, generally there is. But these people are operating off the assumption that they know what mechanism underlies this phenomenon. And generally, and shout out Paul Carter, this is Paul Carter and Chris Bisley just spreading this far and wide.
Hell yeah.
Generally, what they assume is the case is that the increased hypertrophy from lengthened training stems from a greater amount of passive tension, right? Which then means that only muscle groups that actually experience more passive tension during lengthened training or during certain positions will also hypertrophy more. The issue there is we don't have any direct evidence linking passive tension to hypertrophy from lengthened training, and that for sure being the mechanism, right? Yeah. And specifically, there's kind of even more assumptions baked into that, where it's like, okay, passive tension will then lead to sarcomerogenesis, or the addition of sarcomeres in series in a muscle, and sort of more longitudinal hypertrophy. That also hasn't been studied. And as I said earlier, when asked for a citation of actual researchers agreeing with him on this, Paul provided a citation of limb lengthening surgery, which, as far as getting far away from actual lifting and lengthened partials, that is quite a leap of faith,
It's an interesting line of reading that he's got everyone
it's interesting.
He's like, boys, check out this.
It's funny because he even... Go for it.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Could you clarify what you mean by passive lengthen tension on a muscle?
Sure. So passive tension, you can kind of visualize your muscle and tendon unit, right? So your muscle and the connective tissue that attaches to it. You can visualize that as being a rubber band. As you lengthen or stretch out that rubber band, tension builds up. It wants to return to its sort of normal resting length. And so when you're doing lengthen training or training in the stretch position when you're lifting weights, you are lengthening that muscle past its resting length. And for most muscles, that will lead up to some amount of passive tension being built up. Since tension leads to hypertrophy, broadly speaking, that's the one mechanism that we have the most evidence for directly leading to hypertrophy. The assumption is passive tension is the thing that separates lengthened training from shortened training. The reality is there's a lot of things here that we don't understand yet. For example, lengthened training seems to lead to more distal hypertrophy or more hypertrophy in a certain area of the muscle than shortened training.
To what degree, that might be hard to articulate. It's like noticeable to the eye, I imagine not, or like.
I don't know, man. I mean, I don't
distal,
think
so like
many things.
lengthen partials with your bicep. Oh, that's the bit that hangs out of the sleeve. That sounds
Indeed.
pretty
Hey, that's
useful.
all that matters. Indeed, yeah.
Oh wow. Yeah, true.
Honestly, none of these effects really are visible, I think. I think it's the sad truth with a lot of these things is that like with range of motion, we're talking about like a 5 or 10% difference in hypertrophy. If you're doing lengthened partials, for example, instead of full range of motion.
It's
5 or 10%
for an
is just
advanced bodybuilder. Like
for sure. But if you're gaining a pound a year,
yeah.
If you're like trying to gain a pound of muscle a year for an advanced person, right? You might be talking about an extra 5 or 10% on top of that. So that might be like an 1.1 pound a year. Can you really tell that you gain an extra 40 grams of muscle this year? Truth is, you can't, not visually, especially. And so, no, you probably couldn't tell.
What is because I think it was in the review of the recent squats versus hip thrust study, and correct me if I'm wrong if I'm misquoting you, I think you kind of asserted through that debate, you're like, man, this would have been a better lengthened versus shortened by study. Like, fuck your squats versus hip thrusts. I'm sick of the squats versus hip thrust study. But thinking of it as a lengthened, and was it also you who said you should have whacked the RDL in there and compared that to the hip thrust?
It wasn't me, but I can see the rationale. Yeah.
Just for like making it sort of similar. But I was going to say, people talk about as well, the glutes being one of those special muscles where like the length tension relationship rules might not apply so much. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, we actually have a few studies on the glutes, so I have many thoughts. And since you mentioned the RDL, we have a study not on the RDL exactly, but on a movement pattern that's overwhelmingly similar, and that is a multi-hip machine with the knees kept pretty straight. So it's essentially like an RDL where your knees are kept pretty straight and you're just performing hip extension. And that study hasn't been published yet. It's a conference abstract, so stay with me here. But it is by a research group that I think at this point has some credibility. They've done like 3 studies on range of motion already. That's MILO and colleagues. They've done the leg curl study, for example, the tricep study, and so forth. Basically, they compared doing a full range of motion on the multi-hip, so getting like from full hip extension, so 0 degrees of hip flexion, to 100 degrees of hip flexion, so like a pretty bent hip, right? So like a good muscle length,
like
for
IPF depth sort of squat.
IPF depth, for sure.
That's the visual in my head.
More like a deadlift because it's a knee straight or relatively straight, so it's like an RDL.
Sorry.
So they compared a full range of motion, 0 to 100 degrees, to doing lengthened partials or only the lengthened half, and they saw more hypertrophy in the glutes and more hypertrophy in the hamstrings as well, broadly speaking. And so that's one piece of evidence. It's like, okay, well, maybe the glutes do respond to lengthened training here. And the second thing is we have a study by Kubo and colleagues comparing a half squat to a deeper squat. And while they saw the same quad hypertrophy in both groups, which suggests that half squats, for the quads at least, may not be such a bad thing. And I think this kind of goes to show how most people half squat potentially, where when they half squat, they don't really bend over a ton, right? Like they stay pretty upright. They kind of just go in through their knees.
Yeah.
And so maybe at that point, you're getting enough knee range of motion and quad stretch that you're getting solid quad hypertrophy. But for the glutes and the adductors, they did see about like 2 or 3 times as much hypertrophy going from like a half squat to a below parallel squat. So amongst 3 studies that we can broadly speaking argue measure hypertrophy from longer versus shorter muscle length training, 2 of them have found more hypertrophy with longer muscle length training. The squat and hip thrust study is the one that hasn't found a difference. But then you could argue with that study, as opposed to the other 2 studies, we're talking about different exercises, you know? So
yeah, it should be. If you're looking at ROM, it's like do the same exercise. Don't
exactly
short ROM and a short and bias length of bias sort of exercise.
Have you had any studies? I know that's a pretty big topic around sort of the social media, more specifically TikTok scene, on the difference between sort of just doing lengthened partials and doing like mechanical drop set where you're just absolutely destroying, let's say, your arm or something like that.
Are you talking about where you go all the way down to like arms not moving because the whole back end of that in theory is like
Yeah,
length
where
and
you
partial.
do, I believe you would do shortened and then lengthened. Is that what it is? Because
Yeah, I've
technically
seen that a
short.
lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, so in the research, we don't have anything like that. It's certain people, certain TikTok influencers have made this very popular, but we don't have any research on this. There's a chance it works, and it kind of makes sense that it would. But I think that one thing we can be reasonably confident on at this stage is that the benefit of lengthened training kind of just comes from spending more time lifting weights in lengthened positions. The issue with mechanical drop sets is that they take about half of that time spent lifting and actually make you spend it at shortened positions, or like if you're doing a shortened to lengthened biased drop set. And like if the benefit from lengthened training comes from actually lifting at long muscle lengths, then why would you spend half the set lifting at short muscle lengths?
True.
It's kind of like you really like apple juice, right? So you could just drink apple juice, straight apple juice, it's delicious. Or you could just water it down with like half of your own feces. And it's like, it's still going to be kind of tasty, half apple juice.
It's
Like,
a great analogy.
why would you not just drink apple juice? You get me?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
In terms of speculating about mechanisms, is there something to be said for like the shortened position fails first? In my experience, lengthen tends to fail after. Is lengthen did they standardize proximity to failure, or like could you even? And so I guess my question is, does lengthen partials just help you train with a closer proximity to failure?
You're a sneaky fucker. That's a good point. So basically, that is going to be part of the mechanism, I think. As you mentioned, for most
So
movements,
full
you
wrong
do
guys are
fail.
soft.
Basically, yeah. You do fail most of the time at more shortened positions. So if you just end the set when you hit full range of motion failure, you end the set reasonably early. Whereas if you go
Miles
past
away
that,
from
and just
lengthened.
exactly. And so that is one part of the studies that isn't standardized. It might just be that part of the effect is because you're just ending the set later, closer to quote unquote true failure, right? The two things. One, it's probably not the only mechanism at play. And the reason I say that is because that wouldn't explain away the differences in regional hypertrophy we see. As I said, we see more hypertrophy specifically in distal areas, close to the insertion point of a muscle. To our knowledge, training closer to failure doesn't accomplish this at all. It doesn't really change regional hypertrophy. So something else has to be going on there. The second thing I'll say is we're actually planning a study potentially in the summer of 2024 to compare lengthened partials. So, and you end those lengthened partials when you can't get another lengthened partial rep. So that's kind of closer to true failure than if you just ended a full range of motion set when you couldn't get a full rep anymore. So comparing lengthened partials to full range of motion, but where you continue the set with just lengthened partials until you can't do another lengthened partial to see, okay, well, is the effect on hypertrophy here only mediated by training closer to failure? Because maybe it is, but it's unlikely, as I said, given that there are differences in regional hypertrophy that we currently can't explain away with just you train closer to failure.
Hypothetically, let's pretend that more evidence keeps coming out to support lengthened partial training. Let's just say it's a landslide, like it just demolishes it. Can you speculate as to how you would change your training? And sorry, maybe you could tell us as well, with the current evidence, how have you introduced lengthened partials to your training? Say the evidence keeps getting better. Do you see a point where you would remove all shortened bias training? Is there secondary reasons for that? Play that out for us, please.
For sure. So as I said, man, coming into my PhD, my bias was pro full range of motion. I was actually working for Renaissance periodization. I was doing only full range of motion, etc. And so about 2.5 years ago now, when I first got the results of my meta-analysis and I laid eyes on them, I was like, okay, let's, I wasn't ready to take the full deep dive into lengthened partials. So I started doing like lengthened partials at the end of my full range of motion set, right? Like just pumping out some lengthened partials at the end. And that was fine. I gradually did that. I did it mostly on back training and side delt training and bicep training because I figured those were the movements where generally you fail in a shortened position. And therefore doing those reps at the end would meaningfully change that set for the better. And then gradually, as the evidence became more certain, so at the time we had like 3 studies, now we have 5, we have more studies looking at partial range of motion at different muscle lengths, and in general, it's just become a lot more clear. Nowadays, for the past year now, I've done exclusively lengthened partials for hypertrophy. I have done some full range of motion, and let me caveat that is only for strength. I was training for increasing my deadlift, squat, and bench, and overhead press, but I was only on those actual lifts. I didn't do any accessory lifts. So like functionally for the past year, 95% of my training has been length and partials on everything. And nowadays,
you're
if a
already
client comes to me,
convinced
I'm doing
enough,
it.
or is this the
Yeah.
it's all a self-experiment always, isn't it?
I mean, even if it was a self-experiment, I'm not sure how much I could tell from my own experience. Like, it would be like, okay, I can't even measure a difference in hypertrophy this small. So, like,
Yeah.
it's not really a good experiment. But
Sweet pumps?
I've been doing it because, sorry, sweet pump. Hey,
Sweet
sweet pump for
pumps?
sure.
Yeah.
What I'll say is nowadays, if a client comes to me and is like, look, I don't care about how I train. I don't have any preferences or biases or anything. I just want to get jacked. I don't care about anything else. Honestly, something like 50 to 100% of their training will be length and partials. For me, I would probably give them 100%. But if they have any sort of preference towards full range of motion or any sort of hybrid goals where maybe like they mostly care about hypertrophy, but also want to get some strength gains in sort of a general full range of motion, I might include about like 50% of their training is full range of motion, maybe the heavier stuff, so they can actually track progression on those lifts from years ago when they were doing them with full range of motion as well.
Are there any muscle groups or a list of movements where you've tried it and just like logistically it doesn't work? Like, what are the areas where like, yes, length and partials for these all day. The other one's like, oh, it just doesn't work out practically.
Yeah, there's a few. Not so much muscle groups, just more so movements. I would say the free weight barbell squat and the free weight barbell bench are just kind of a pain.
Just
because
bouncing in the hole and then you fail.
Bouncing. And then like, how do you end the set? Either you need a spotter to help you up all the way so you can re-rack the weight, right?
Yeah.
Or you start the set from the bottom, which is awkward for both the squat and the bench, right? And you need to set up spotter arms perfectly. And even if you do, that usually means you're cutting out the depth a little bit at the bottom. So like, it's just an awkward thing to do. Just do a Smith machine squat instead if you're going for hypertrophy anyways.
And maybe like do some 1 1/4s.
Maybe some 1 1/4s, yeah, absolutely. Or you can do like integrated partials, right? Like where you just do 1 full rep, a few partials, 1 full rep, a few partials. But then you still have to end the set when you can just about get a full rep, which isn't as close to true failure as possible. So it doesn't really give you the best stimulus. I would say Smith machine is your best friend there. And then other movements, I would say leg press and hack squat are kind of a pain. Depending on the machine you have, you may just have the same issue. If your safety is low enough, you can re-rack it safely after a partial. And I actually have the fortune of having leg press like that. But like certain leg presses won't let you go deep enough, right? Which just like stops you from going deep. So you can't get even a good stretch to begin with. Other leg presses will let you do that, but don't have a safety you can re-rack it out. The same goes for hack squats. And so on those movements, typically it can be a bit hit or miss as well. But depending on your machine, you may or may not be able to make it work. Honestly, all other movements, like machine movements, dumbbell movements, generally are a great option for length and partials. And so you can pretty much train all muscle groups with length and partials pretty safely. But obviously, use your common sense.
Right. A little bit of a segue out of the ROM chat for now. Where do you see the role of periodization for hypertrophy training? Maybe I should give a bit more context. I've been speculating. I've been on a big fuck periodization sort of thing for a while. Sorry, I organize training, but in terms of like, if in terms of S&C and for sports performance, it has a lot of like inbuilt predictive qualities, and I just don't like to try to predict performances or anything like that. And then projecting that thought process over to hypertrophy, I'm like, what is the role of periodization? And like, because I can see it from just like cognitive, like, give me something new to do. Everyone loves a new program, right? Give me some new shit to do. But outside of that, I'm struggling to understand what is the role. Do you see a role for it outside of that?
Not really, man. So the direct data on periodization for hypertrophy, we have some meta-analyses on the topic. It doesn't actually seem to do anything. I think psychologically, like you mentioned, it probably does help, where novelty can absolutely play a role. And hey, maybe it makes you train a little bit harder because you're like, oh, this is a new movement. I can enjoy it more, put more effort in, what have you. But as far as the actual physiology goes, not a whole lot. I will say periodization, and there was a paper on this recently called The Myth of Periodization. It's a very loosely defined term.
Was this John Kiley?
It might be John Kiley. I think it was, I know James Steele and James Fisher were on it. Those are my supervisors, hence why I know. Nice. But it's a very loosely defined term. It's not very clearly operationalized. And so testing is actually quite difficult. Like, for example, programming itself could be argued to be periodization. If you do something different on Monday versus Tuesday, that's daily undulating periodization. Like, you get me? Yeah. So it's a weird term.
Show me, and no one can show me a non-periodized program.
Exactly. It's just like, what do you do? Like, you train the exact same thing every single day, same weights, same everything. Like, okay, it's just weird. So the one thing I'll say is periodization as a means to fine tune training to keep it effective is probably how I'd frame it. So if, for example, you're recovering just fine and you think you could benefit from more volume as far as hypertrophy goes, adding volume week to week, you could argue that's periodization, but it might just be a way to keep you at your most effective volume, right? And that's how I would approach periodization. I would say change stuff when you get bored and change variables to keep you at your most effective training place so that you're putting in work in, day out, and getting your best hypertrophy. That's how I see it.
We need to get rid of the word, because like as soon as you learn about the word periodization, you're like, because if someone was like, yeah, it's just how you organize training, you'd be like, oh, I don't need to read any books on that. But then they create a new word for it. You're like, oh, this is
buzzword.
Something different. Like one of the greatest buzzwords of all time. Shout out to back in the day. One last question, because this has been fucking amazing. Where are the biggest gaps in the evidence in regards to training for hypertrophy that you would love to see filled in over the coming years? Maybe if I can push you away from ROM, because I'm sure that's going to take up quite a bit of your career, but that you would like some other people to do the spade work. You're sorting out ROM for us. What else do we need?
A couple things. One would be actually looking at fatigue from high volume, close to failure programs. I think there's a lot of fear mongering regarding, oh, we couldn't do high volumes, like I'm talking past 20 sets per muscle.
Everyone's been
close to failure
about that study.
Yeah, man, they hate it. So that's one thing is like, okay, can people actually recover from high volumes for all muscle groups at once, say like 200 plus sets a week, close to failure? Because I've done that in the past and you can make it work, I think.
I'm not a hater on the study, but even my knee-jerk reaction to reading the study, I was like,
exactly.
that is some work.
We just don't know. But there have been people who have done this sort of thing. Like, look at Ronnie Coleman's routine. Motherfucker was doing like 300 plus sets a week sometimes.
Man, he was doing everything. He was blasting heavy doubles. He was fucking.
Oh, for sure. He got jacked. So clearly it wasn't so big of an issue that it prevented him from being quite stacked, Yeah. And so we just don't have evidence on that. We have a lot of studies on like individual muscle groups, high volumes for those. But as far as high volumes across the board, relatively close to failure, we just don't know. That's one thing. The second thing is just higher volume research. We haven't really found a clear like cap to how much volume you can do and how much hypertrophy you see. We have like 6 studies looking at volumes over 20 or 25 sets per week per muscle group, comparing that to like 10 to 20. And then in 4 of those, we found more hypertrophy with higher volumes. So there are some methodological potential concerns there with like muscle swelling.
Who's signing up for that?
That's true. But like as far as actually finding that upper limit of how much volume do you benefit from in terms of hypertrophy, we just haven't really found it yet. So I want to see more of that evidence. The final thing I'll say is we don't really have a ton of evidence regarding, we know that failure is more fatiguing inherently than not failing. So keeping a couple reps in the tank on a given set versus going to failure, you'll get more fatigue from going to failure. We don't have a ton of evidence looking at how that changes if you actually consistently train a failure. So as you acclimate to it, because we know the body responds and adapts to most stimuli. So it has a repeat bout effect wherein as you repeatedly expose it, for example, to training in the gym, lifting weights, you get less and less sore, less and less muscle damage over time. And that should also apply to train to failure. And if people are fear-mongering failure as if it's going to fatigue you, throw you in a high fatigue ditch, but there's a good chance that after you're used to it, I wouldn't see it causing much more fatigue, right? Because ultimately, as far as like volume load goes, you're doing an additional rep. Is that really going to cause a world difference in terms of fatigue? I don't know. And so I want to see, does more fatigue subsist with training to failure as you get more used to it? That's another thing.
Yeah, because who's doing it that often? They are out there, but again, we're not observing them that keenly. Great answer, by the way. My final question, which is a bit worse of a question, it just goes back to my steroid fetish. I'm always interested about how steroids work, but it's related to the pump. I was pestering all the guys who do gear at my old gym. I was like, what's the go? Like, because they were so explaining, like, it doesn't just double your test. When you inject testosterone, you crank it through the roof. You 10x at 50. I don't actually know the number. They were also saying that when you're on a bunch of gear, and I don't know if this is certain types of steroids, it increases the amount of cellular swelling you can get. It just helps you, like, and people do talk about like steroids leading to water retention. Yeah, so does that support the idea that the pump is one of the mechanisms potentially of, does that is there anything to that, or
I mean, it might just be a correlate. So I think that people, there's a few things.
it's happening alongside it? Yeah.
Yeah, happening alongside it. I think maybe you could argue, and this is not my area of expertise, huge disclaimer.
No,
one
we all
thing you do
natty
see is that-
bodybuilder, natty bodybuilding champion,
Hey,
guys.
that's me. That's me. As you take steroids, generally you gain weight, and also it has various angiotensive effects, aka your blood pressure goes up. And generally,
fluids
it's
going
hard to get a
everywhere.
pump. Indeed. Generally, it's hard to get a pump when you have low blood pressure, and easier to have one when you have a high blood pressure, I think. So maybe that's a factor there. I don't know. But I don't think we can say that steroids only make you more jacked because they give you a juicier pump. That's,
There's a bunch of people who heard you say that and they're like, right, I need to increase my blood pressure. Fuck the beetroot
Exactly.
juice before you work out. Just living that high cholesterol life. Just sick
man, the
early
pump's
grade,
gonna
but
make you
the
jacked.
pumps just
That's all that
Anything
matters.
for the
especially
pumps.
the sodium you get off those really unhealthy meals. It just works.
Yeah, man. It's interesting with sodium, and bro, this is so far outside of my
Is
wheelhouse.
that not a thing for pumps?
I think it is a thing for pumps.
Okay.
But as far as health goes, I'm not sure it has. And like, this is so far outside of my wheelhouse. I'm just gonna put this out as the hottest take.
I'll
Take
just
this
say,
with
yeah, come on,
a mine of salt.
flip this.
I'm not sure it's a huge effect on health compared to like much bigger things like just being obese.
Yeah.
And being active. You know.
Whereas, but they just happen, like I said, same as though they just happen to be consuming so much salt.
Yep.
This was sick. Thank you for coming on the show. If you would like to be found, and if you'd like to announce anything you have coming up or how people can reach out to you, give us the pitch.
Nah, bro, I'm just like natural hypertrophy. I stay off the radar. You won't ever know my real first name. It's not actually Milo.
Surface. Wait, what?
Anyways, no, it is actually Milo.
Ah,
But
oh.
natural hypertrophy doesn't like to. He doesn't like to divulge his own first name.
Ooh.
So I know, very mysterious. Anyhow, you can find me on Instagram at Wolf Coach. That's my last name in Coach. You can find me on YouTube at Wolf Coaching, and that's probably the place I'm most active. And then finally, if you want to find my research, just type in my full name, Milo Wolf, and ResearchGate, and you'll find all of my research on range of motion, on training to failure or not, and all that stuff.
Well, there you go, guys. Fuck your full ROM. Get some length and partials into you, and keep training variously.
Peace.